Hello again. We're going to have a quick look at the worksheet control of the company, which is in the company section, as you will have found. So the worksheet down here, we'll just jump across pre-incorporation for a little while and come to control, and then turn back to that area. So if we bring up the worksheet itself, it's broken into a number of areas, such as the Constitution, share rights, major transactions, and this video we'll just talk about the Constitution and shareholders to get the basics understood. So before we start, we just really want to ask a question: what do we mean by control? Now, to answer that, I've broken the roles down in a Google Doc, which I can put a link to. So just working through this diagram, make it a wee bit bigger. So control itself, we've got directors, we've got shareholders, and they both have forms of control. If we talk first about shareholders, because they are the people who own the company, they don't own the assets, they own the company. The company itself owns its assets. That's confusing to ask. However, for now, the shareholders, what do? Well, they vote, and one of their key votes is appointing directors. So they get to appoint the directors, and that's done by a simple majority vote. So if I have 51% of the votes in a company, I can appoint the directors. If I don't like what they do, I can also remove the directors. This puts a lot of pressure on directors to follow the directions of shareholders. But we need to be clear that directors owe their duty to the company, not to the shareholders. Now, of course, they have duties to the shareholders as the people who own the company, but their primary fiduciary duty is to the company, and they must put the company first. Well, that is, of course, going to create conflict issues at times. So the shareholders vote, they appoint directors, they have meetings, so they attend meetings. At these meetings, they can ask questions of directors, and they can have a shareholders resolution saying what they want. But the directors have to think, is that in the best interest of the company? If yes, do it. If not, they can say no. So the shareholders cannot directly tell the directors of the company what to do. Now, where this leads us is to say no day-to-day role, and that's really important. But what they can do is create a set of rules that control or limit the actions of directors, what the company might do in terms of its business, or pretty much anything else. Now, these rules are in the document we call the Constitution. This is very much analogous to the partnership agreement, except we file this with the Companies Office and it can be searched as we looked at previously, and you can see what those rules are. Changes are by special resolution, so that's a vote as well, but notice it's a higher vote with a minimum percentage of 75%. If the shareholders, however, give themselves day-to-day or management powers in the Constitution, they will then be considered directors if they use that power. Now, this is a very significant qualification, and we'll see this when we look at section 126 on who are deemed to be directors. The intent of the Companies Act is the shareholders appoint the directors, they make up a set of rules, and then they let them get on with running the company and acting in the best interests of the company. So if they go outside of that role by giving themselves special powers, such as to vote on any major acquisition of a capital asset, for example, then when they make that decision and vote for it, they will have the same liability as a director for that decision only. However, this is relatively unusual. Mostly we just look at that area, and the shareholders create the rules, change the rules, and that's how they control the directors. When we turn to the directors themselves, their role is to manage or ensure the company is managed. So the company under section 128 must be under the management of the directors. It's not necessarily a day-to-day role. Directors may be in a day-to-day role, such as a managing director, and we would call that person an executive director. Others are non-executive or independent directors, which is good governance. The directors must follow the Constitution and the rules in the Companies Act, but we could have a conflict. So which one wins? In the same way as the Partnership Act rules, the answer to that is that the statute always wins unless it allows the rules to be changed. Now, let's go back to the worksheet and just go through the Constitution questions in this short video. So, what is a Constitution? Define it. Put it in words that make sense to yourself. It's a set of rules. Give some examples here. What would you put in those rules? And that's what you're doing in the assignment. So take this definition, then think, well, for my particular company, do I want limits on the spending power of directors? Do I want 2 directors to sign all checks? What controls, what's good governance for our business? As we go through these worksheets, you'll find there's a lot of things we can use the Constitution for apart from simply limiting powers of directors. How do we change the Constitution? Now let's go to the Companies Act itself and have a look at section 32. We look briefly at some of these sections. So section 32, Company Constitution Part 5. You'll see we don't have to have a constitution. If we have a constitution, it's going to be binding and set out the rights, powers and duties of the board, the shareholders and directors, except to the extent they are negated or modified in accordance with the Act by the Constitution. So negated or modified by the Constitution of the company, but it says in accordance with this Act. So what that means is if we have a Constitution, it's binding on the board, each director, board being all the directors collectively, each director and each shareholder, provided that it is done in accordance with the Act. And so we'll see as we go through sections that say subject to the Constitution, very much like in partnership. If you don't have a Constitution, the powers, rights and duties and obligations are set out in the Act. Now, how do we go about changing the Constitution? We use section 32. So, by special resolution may adopt the Constitution for the company. Right, so we can adopt and we can change a Constitution by special resolution. What is a special resolution? Section 2. And we'll go down. Most of these are red because I pre-highlight them so I can actually find them. So a special resolution is a resolution approved by a majority of 75%. You'll notice it says or, so the alternative is a higher majority required by the Constitution. This is why if an investor is investing and getting 10% in a company, they know that they don't have enough votes to stop changes in the Constitution. So they may say, if I'm going to invest in your company all this money, then I want you to change the Constitution. So a special resolution is 85%. It'd have to be 91% if I'm 10%, wouldn't it? So we'll change it to 91% so that you can't change it without my consent. And that's relatively common. Now, you also notice it says Section 106. Now, why do we care about Section 106? And that's because it is intended to protect minority shareholders. Now, Section 106 is a repetition in some ways of Section 32. It says shareholders exercise a power to adopt, alter of a company's constitution. It must be by special resolution. We already know that. But what happens next is Section 110 comes along, and it's under the heading Minority Buyout Rights. And it says where a shareholder is entitled to vote on a power in Section 106, so for example, a power to change the Constitution, and the shareholder casts all their votes against exercise the power, but they lose, the resolution is passed, then that shareholder is entitled to require the company to purchase those shares by following the procedure from section 111. So if I buy shares in a company and I say have 20% of the shares and I paid my $50,000, then I read the Constitution at the time and I saw the rules and I was happy, and now they changed them. Now I can't stop them. All I can do is vote against them. I do get the right to ask them to buy my shares. So have a look at section 32, very simple rules and relate to special resolution. Section 106 simply reinforces that. Can the rules on the Constitution be changed? Well, you should be able to answer that. Now, this question is asking you to consider, well, what changes to the Constitution would I make to protect minority shareholders? So if a person has 15% of the voting rights, do I need to change that? Well, they're under the 25%, so perhaps we do. A 30%. A shareholder with a class of shares with no voting rights. We'll talk about classes of shares shortly, but they're just groups of shares. And if we have shareholders in different groups, we have the power in the Constitution to give them different rights. And one of those rights might be you don't get to vote, which means they can't vote on adopting a Constitution, they can't vote on changing it, so therefore they can't vote against it under section 110 either. Now in D, what rights does it give the minority shareholder? There's a minority rights diagram on Canvas which follows through the process in section 110 to 115. What you want to think about is, if I vote against this resolution, will the company buy my shares? So you'll see a very straightforward procedure of valuation and agreement of the value of the shares, but then you run into the problem, what if the company doesn't have the money or can't pay, or it's just unfair on other shareholders? Can the company be excused from buying your shares? Now I'm just going to go back a little bit because there's one thing that can be quite confusing here. A shareholder with a class of shares with no voting rights, how does that relate to what we talked about in a special resolution? Now, when we go back to that definition of a special resolution, we said it's 75% of the vote. Right? It's of the votes of shareholders entitled to vote. So normally in most companies they have one class of shares, everybody gets a vote, so it means a special resolution is 75% or a higher number if you agree it in your constitution for everyone. But if we had two classes of shares, an investor has say 30% of the shares entitled to receive dividend, but their class has no voting rights, and the other class of shares has all the voting rights, then the other class of shares by themselves vote on changes to the Constitution. And since that investor class had no right to vote, they couldn't vote against it when they make those changes, which affects their rights under section 110. Now that might be a bit confusing, and we can talk through that one in class. So we'll stop now and we'll come back to directors under the appointing directors under that worksheet shortly.